Welcome to the second video of this section, loading data from a web server. In the previous video, we examined the data that we'll be working with throughout this section and the course. Now we're going to look at how we use D3.js to load that data from a web server into our JavaScript application. In this video, we're going to look at two things. The first of those is using the capabilities of D3.js to load CSV data from the server into our JavaScript and D3.js application. Then we're going to look at mapping that data into a data model that facilitates our creation of a data visualization. So let's jump back into VS Code and see how we code loading this data. Okay, we're back in Visual Studio Code. Now let's see how we code loading data. Let's go and open the File Explorer, and to remind ourselves, let's open the data folder, and we're going to be using the year 2015.csv data file. The code template is 1.1.2, so let's go into Begin and open the index.html file. Right now this file just contains the bare minimum HTML that we need to start creating our application. Let's add some code to load this data. D3.js comes with a number of built-in functions you can use to load data from a web server. The one we'll be using is D3.csv. This function takes two parameters, the first of which is the path to your data file. Now this can be a URL, but since we're in a local solution, we can use a relative path. And we're going to specify year 2015.csv. The second parameter is a lambda function. We'll create one here. That is called when the data is finished loading or upon an error. This function has two parameters. The first, which is past an error, if there is an error, and the second is the actual data that was loaded. This now will load the data, but we won't see anything. So let's add a couple console.log statements. The first will log the error, and the second will log the actual data. Let's go and run this small piece of code. Let's open up the integrated terminal. There we go. And start live server. And up pops Chrome with the default page for live server. Now to start the application, we're going to have to change our launch.json. I've included a launch.json inside of the folder there. So let's go and change the main launch.json to make sure it has that content in there. So you can see we're going to do 1.1.2. Now let's drag Visual Studio Code over to the side and kind of split the window between the browser and Visual Studio Code. Close out the File Explorer so we have a little more room over here, and press F5 to start. Now you can see this is started and we don't have any output. But if we come back over and open the debug console, you'll see that we do have some output here. So you'll see that the output for the error parameter was null. And the data is actually an array of 247 objects. Going back to the JavaScript, those 247 objects are the data that's passed into this function. You see we can expand this in the output here, and we'll see that we have columns for each of those. So D3.js automatically figured out the columns from the first row. Then we have all these other elements in the array, each one of them being an object, each one representing a particular row. So you can see here we have country code ABW, country name Aruba, fertility rate is 1.646999 for this country in this year. So this is pretty neat. Just that one statement's pulled in all these different objects and done this parsing like this. Loading data in D3.js is typically that easy. It's got some built-in functions that are very powerful. Now let's change this so this is a file that doesn't exist and restart this application and take a look at the debug output that we're getting here. So let's hop back over to the debug console, find, and the data parameter was passed a progress event, which can be used to get information on the error that occurred. So let's change this back and just see that this runs again. So get rid of the X and restart, rerun, and we have our array back. So let's stop the debugger and close the output window. Now what we're going to look at here is If you remember, the data that came in are floating point numbers like fertility rate came in as strings. So we're going to look at how we can convert the data into floating point numbers for those fields. We're going to do this conversion with a concept in D3.js known as mapping. Let's create a variable called fixed data, and we're going to assign to this variable the result of a mapping. We'll take our data and call map. The map function will take another lambda function, which will be passed each and every item in that data variable. So if you remember, we had 247 objects in there, so each one will be passed to this function. This function can return a new value for each item, but for now we're just going to do a console log in D to show you how this is working. So let's start this, execute with F5 and open up the output window, debug console, and you'll see that we have a whole bunch of objects written out here. So each one of those is one of the data objects that we saw before. Let's close the output window and stop the debugger. This function passed to the map function can return a new object for each object that's passed in. So I'm going to paste some code in here that creates a new JavaScript object and return it. So let's format this code real quick. So highlight everything and format document. And let's get rid of our console log. Don't need that anymore. And examine what this is doing. So this is creating a new JavaScript object. So we have country code, country name, just passing in what's coming in from D. Then the life expectancy, we're going to use the JavaScript plus nomenclature here, which converts a string into a number. So it's going to see that this is a double. So we're going to get a floating point value out of this. Do the same for fertility rate and population. And then the remaining two fields, let's just copy them into the new object. And let's add a line down here. After this is all done, let's log that new output. So the fixed data will be these new objects. And let's kick this off on the debugger. So it's up and running. Let's hop over to the debug console where we should see the output from this. So there's the debug console. And we'll see we have two outputs here. So we'll see we had error data. Actually, there's three because we have the null. The first array of data, which was in here and has our original objects where those properties are still strings. Let's close that array and open up the other array, which is our fixed data. Now, if we expand one of these, the first one here, we'll see now that we have our fertility rate, life expectancy, and population are now numeric numbers. We're going through this process because these numbers will need to be represented as these floating point numbers when we go to size, bubbles, and do other analytic measurements on this data. This code still has not created any visual output based upon this data. You can see this if we go back into Chrome and inspect this output page. So if we go down, click inspect, you can see that we still have a body element in here, and it doesn't have anything but our D3.js script tag and a couple other script tags that are injected by Live Server in the browser to provide some of the debugging functionality. And that's okay, because this is what we expected. In the next video, we'll look at using the data to create some HTML. All right, so we're at the point now where we've loaded our data and modeled it with JavaScript objects. So now let's go on and look at how we can use D3.js code to create visual elements in our HTML to represent that data.